January 29th, 1945. In the frozen village of Holzheim, Belgium, a U.S. Army first sergeant walked around the corner of a stone farmhouse and stepped straight into a trap. His name was Leonard Alfred Funk, Jr. He was 5'5". He weighed about 140 pounds, and in front of him stood nearly 80 armed German soldiers who had just been prisoners minutes earlier. 4 American guards were on their knees in the snow with their hands on their helmets. German rifles and machine pistols were pointed at their backs. A German patrol had slipped through the storm, overpowered the guards, freed the prisoners, and turned the entire farmyard into an execution ground. Funk did not know that yet. He saw white winter capes, helmets, weapons, and movement around the farmhouse. For 1 second, he thought American reinforcements had arrived. Then a German officer stepped toward him and shoved a machine pistol into his stomach. The officer shouted in German. Funk stared at him. He did not understand a single word, so he laughed, not because he had a plan, not because he thought he was safe, but because the situation was so sudden, so strange, and so impossible that his first reaction was laughter. 80 Germans surrounded 1 American paratrooper. The German officer shouted louder. The gun pushed harder into Funk's body. The 4 American guards looked at him from the ground, waiting to see if they were about to die. Leonard Funk kept laughing. 45 seconds later, the Germans would be back on the ground with their hands raised. But to understand why this small sergeant did not freeze in that farmyard, you have to go back to where his war began. Before the 82nd Airborne Division, before Normandy, before Market Garden, before the Battle of the Bulge, Leonard Funk was not a famous soldier. He was not a giant. He was not the kind of man people imagined when they pictured a battlefield hero. He was a shipping clerk from Pennsylvania. He worked around invoices, boxes, records, and warehouse orders. His life was ordinary, quiet, and predictable. He was careful with details. He showed up on time. He did the work in front of him. Nothing about him told the world that one day he would become one of the most decorated American paratroopers of World War II. Then the Army drafted him. At first, he was just another young man pulled into a war that was growing larger every month. But basic training revealed something that civilian life had never tested. Funk was good under pressure. He learned weapons quickly. He listened carefully. He moved with purpose. More important, other soldiers trusted him. He did not need to shout. He did not need to act bigger than he was. When Leonard Funk gave an order, men followed it. Then he volunteered for the Airborne. That choice changed everything. The paratroopers were not ordinary infantry. They were trained to jump from aircraft behind enemy lines, land in chaos, gather whoever survived the drop, and attack before the enemy understood what was happening. The training was brutal. The runs were long. The jumps were dangerous. The instructors did not care about excuses. Funk stayed. He earned his jump wings. He trained with the Thompson submachine gun, the M1 rifle, grenades, bayonets, and everything a paratrooper might need when he landed alone in enemy territory. By 1943, the Army had made him First Sergeant of Company C, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. He was the senior enlisted man in the company. That meant the officers gave the orders, but Funk made sure the men were ready to carry them out. He checked equipment. He pushed training. He kept discipline. He watched over the young soldiers who would soon jump into Europe with him. Then came June 6, 1944. Normandy, Operation Overlord. The night sky over France was filled with aircraft, flak, fire, and fear. Funk and the men of the 82nd Airborne jumped behind German lines before the beaches were hit. The plan was clean on paper. Drop zones, rally points, roads, bridges, objectives. In the air, everything fell apart. German anti-aircraft guns tore into the formations. Pilots swerved. Planes scattered. Paratroopers were dropped miles from where they were supposed to land. Some came down in fields, some in trees, some in flooded ground. Some never made it out of their harness alive. Funk hit the ground hard. He injured his ankle badly enough that most men would have looked for a medic. Instead, he cut himself free, grabbed his weapon, and started finding Americans. One by one, he gathered scattered paratroopers in the dark. Many were lost, some were wounded, most had no idea where they were. German patrols were moving through the hedgerows. Every road could be a trap. Every farmhouse could hide a machine gun. Funk took command. He had no full company, no clean map, no safe path, only a small group of paratroopers and enemy territory all around them. He led them for days through the French countryside, moving at night, hiding during daylight, avoiding German patrols whenever possible. His ankle swelled inside his boot. Every step hurt. He kept moving anyway. He acted as lead scout because he would not let another man walk into danger first. By the time they reached American lines, every man with him was still alive. For that, Funk received the Silver Star. 3 months later, he jumped again, this time into Holland during Operation Market Garden. The plan was bold. Airborne troops would seize bridges across the Netherlands so Allied armor could drive into Germany and end the war faster. But German resistance was stronger than expected, and the skies were not safe. Funk saw German anti-aircraft guns firing on Allied gliders. Those gliders carried men, jeeps, supplies, and equipment the airborne troops needed to survive. They were slow, fragile, almost helpless on approach. The guns had to be silenced. Funk did not wait for someone else to solve it. He took 2 men. 3 American paratroopers moved against a German flak position. They closed in, opened fire, killed the crews, destroyed the guns, and got back alive. The gliders kept landing. For that action, Funk received the Distinguished Service Cross. By January 1945, Leonard Funk had already proven himself in Normandy and Holland, but his most famous moment came in the snow of Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans had launched their last great offensive in the west. They smashed through the Ardennes forest, trying to split the Allied armies and force a desperate victory before Germany collapsed. The weather was brutal. Snow buried roads. Fog grounded aircraft. Cold killed men almost as quietly as bullets. The 82nd Airborne was rushed into the line. Company C fought through freezing days and darker nights. Men dug foxholes into frozen earth. Artillery fell without warning. German patrols probed the lines. Every movement took effort. Every exposed hand risked frostbite. Then Company C received orders to take Holzheim. The village was held by German troops. The approach was covered in snow. The company was under strength. Many of the men had been fighting for weeks with little rest. During the advance, an artillery shell killed the company executive officer. The second in command was gone. Funk stepped into the gap immediately. He reorganized the company under fire and kept the attack moving. But he needed more men. So he went to the company headquarters section. These were not assault troops. They were clerks, supply men, radio operators, office workers, and support soldiers. Men who handled reports, equipment, messages, and logistics. Funk looked at them and turned them into a fighting platoon. He assigned weapons. He gave them roles. He explained the plan. Then he led them into Holzheim. Through waist-deep snow, under German fire, house by house, they cleared the village. Doors were kicked open. Grenades went in. Rifles followed. Rooms were searched. Germans surrendered or were dragged out. In some buildings, the fighting lasted seconds. In others, shots cracked from stairwells, windows, and dark corners. The clerks fought like infantry, because Funk led from the front. By the time the assault pushed through the village, the Americans had captured dozens of German soldiers. Combined with another American unit, the total reached around 80 prisoners. But Company C was still fighting. The town was not fully secure. Funk could only spare 4 American soldiers to guard the prisoners in a fenced farmyard near a stone farmhouse. 4 Americans, 80 Germans. Then Funk went back to the fight. What he did not know was that another German patrol was moving nearby, hidden by the winter storm. They wore white camouflage capes, nearly blending into the snow and the uniforms of American airborne troops. They saw the farmhouse. They saw the 4 guards. They saw the prisoners. And they moved in. Within seconds, the guards were overwhelmed. The 80 prisoners were freed and armed with captured weapons. The 4 Americans were forced to their knees. The Germans began organizing for a counterattack that would hit Company C from behind, while the Americans were still spread through the village. Then Leonard Funk walked around the corner. and the German officer shoved a gun into his stomach. On September 5, 1945, Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. stood in the White House. The war in Europe was over. Japan had surrendered too. The greatest war in human history had finally ended, leaving cities destroyed, families broken, and millions dead. Funk stood in uniform while President Harry S. Truman prepared to place the Medal of Honor around his neck. He was still the same man from Pennsylvania, still not tall, still not loud, still not the kind of man who looked like a legend from a distance. But the record on the table told a different story. Silver Star for Normandy, Distinguished Service Cross for Holland, Bronze Star, Purple Hearts, and now the Medal of Honor for Holzheim. The citation was read aloud. It described how Funk had been surrounded by a far larger German force, how the enemy had overpowered American guards, how he had faced almost certain death, and how his sudden action recaptured the prisoners and saved his company from attack. The words were polished. The moment they described had not been. The real moment had been cold, dirty, loud, and fast. A farmyard, 4 Americans on their knees, 80 Germans with weapons, a machine pistol against a sergeant's stomach, a laugh, a Thompson, 45 seconds of violence, then silence. President Truman placed the medal around Funk's neck. The cameras flashed. Funk saluted. History had its picture. But Leonard Funk did not spend the rest of his life trying to live inside that photograph. When many men would have traveled the country telling their story, Funk went home. Back to Pennsylvania. Back to ordinary work. Back to quiet streets far from the hedgerows of Normandy, the fields of Holland, and the frozen villages of Belgium. For a time, he returned to the kind of work he had done before the war. Files. Records. Daily routines. The man who had faced German guns in 3 campaigns was once again doing simple, steady work. That sounds impossible until you understand men like Funk. They did not see themselves the way history sees them. To the world, he was a Medal of Honor recipient. To himself, he was a soldier who had done what the moment required. Later, Funk joined the Veterans Administration in Pittsburgh. That work fit him. He had spent the war protecting soldiers in battle. Now he helped them after battle. Veterans came home with missing limbs, damaged lungs, bad memories, nightmares, paperwork they did not understand, and pain they did not know how to explain. Funk knew what war took from men. He had seen it in the snow. He had seen it in aircraft doors before jumps. He had seen it in the faces of soldiers who survived one fight and disappeared in the next. At the Veterans Administration, he helped other veterans get through the system. Benefits, medical care, claims, documents. Problems that looked small on paper but meant everything to the men standing at the desk. He did that work for decades, quietly. No spotlight, no speeches, no need to remind everyone what he had done. His family knew he had served. They knew he had jumped with the 82nd Airborne. They knew about the medal. But Funk was not the kind of father who filled every dinner table with war stories. He did not turn his worst memories into entertainment. He carried them. Like many World War II veterans, he let silence do most of the talking. The men of Company C remembered him differently. They remembered the first sergeant who checked on them before a jump, the man who walked point on a bad ankle so others would not have to, the man who saw flak guns ripping into gliders and attacked them with 2 paratroopers. The man who took clerks and supply troops through a snowstorm and made them believe they could clear a town. The man who laughed at a German officer because he did not understand the order to surrender, and then made surrender the Germans' only option. That is the strange power of Leonard Funk's story. It does not begin with a giant. It begins with a shipping clerk, a short man from Pennsylvania who could have lived an entirely ordinary life if history had not dragged him into uniform. He was not built like a movie hero. He did not need to be. War does not always choose the biggest man. Sometimes it chooses the one who can think while everyone else is frozen, the one who can move while others are staring, the one who understands that hesitation can kill more men than bullets. At Holzheim, Funk had no time for a perfect plan. He did not have artillery. He did not have a squad ready behind him. He did not have a clean line of retreat. He had a Thompson, a few seconds, and 4 Americans on their knees. That was enough. Because in combat, some moments are decided before most men even understand they have begun. The German officer thought the fight was over. Funk knew it had just started. The Germans thought they were taking one more prisoner. Funk turned them back into prisoners. That is why the 45 seconds in that farmyard still matter. Not because of how many rounds were fired, not because of how many men fell, but because one soldier refused to let fear take command of the moment. The German plan had been dangerous. Free the prisoners, arm them, strike Company C from behind while the Americans were still clearing the village. If it had worked, the cost could have been terrible. Men who had just survived the assault on Holzheim might have been cut down from the rear. The village could have fallen back into German hands. The wounded could have been trapped. The line could have been thrown into confusion. Funk stopped that before it became disaster. 45 seconds. That was the distance between a German counterattack and an American victory. After the war, honors continued to follow him, but Funk never chased them. Roads, memorials, military halls of fame, ceremonies, dedications, all of them came because others remembered what he had done. He lived quietly, worked for veterans, raised his family, and let the medals speak only when someone else asked. Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. died in 1992. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, a soldier among soldiers. His grave marker carries the words that official history needs: rank, unit, decorations, dates. But no stone can fully hold the story. No marker can show the snow in Holzheim. No engraved line can recreate the sound of the Thompson. No official record can make you feel what those 4 American guards felt when the man who walked into their execution turned and fought. That is why stories like this have to be told, because war history is not only generals, maps, tanks, and arrows moving across Europe. It is also a small sergeant stepping into a farmyard. It is a German officer shouting words he cannot understand. It is laughter in the face of a loaded gun. It is the decision to act before fear can speak. Leonard Funk survived Normandy. He survived Market Garden. He survived the Battle of the Bulge. He survived the road into Germany. But the moment that defined him lasted less than a minute. Germans told this U.S. sergeant to surrender. 45 seconds later, they were his prisoners. Most people have never heard his name. They know D-Day. They know the Battle of the Bulge. They know the 82nd Airborne. But they do not know the 5'5" first sergeant from Pennsylvania who turned a captured farmyard into one of the fastest reversals of World War II. So remember him. First Sergeant Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. Shipping Clerk. Paratrooper. Medal of Honor recipient. The man who laughed when surrender was demanded. The man who moved when everyone else was trapped. The man who gave 4 Americans a chance to stand up again. Hit like for him, not for us. Subscribe if you want more forgotten World War II stories like this. Stories from Normandy, the Ardennes, airborne battles, and the frozen corners of history where ordinary men did impossible things and then went home without asking the world to remember. The German officer shouted again. His face was red from the cold, from anger, and from the shock of seeing an American sergeant walk directly into the middle of the farmyard as if he belonged there. Funk looked from the officer to the soldiers behind him. Rifles, machine pistols, captured American weapons, German prisoners who were no longer prisoners, 4 American guards still on their knees. Everything was wrong. But Funk still did not understand the words being screamed at him. The officer wanted him to surrender. Funk only heard noise, so he laughed harder. The Germans stared at him. Some thought he was insane. Some thought he was mocking them. Some tightened their grip on their weapons. The officer barked another order and gestured toward Funk's Thompson submachine gun, which was slung over his shoulder. Now Funk understood one thing. They wanted his weapon. Slowly, he reached for the Thompson. The German officer took a half-step back, still aiming the machine pistol at him. He believed Funk was obeying. The other Germans believed it too. The small American was surrounded, outnumbered, and finished. Of course he would hand over the gun. Funk lifted the Thompson off his shoulder. Carefully, calmly, as if surrendering it. The farmyard held its breath. The 4 American guards watched from the snow. They could not move. Not yet. Not while so many German weapons were pointed at them. Funk brought the Thompson around his body. The muzzle dropped, then rose. The German officer saw the movement too late. Funk pulled the trigger. The Thompson roared. The burst slammed into the officer's chest and knocked him backward into the snow. For one split second, the entire farmyard froze. Then Funk turned the weapon on the mass of Germans behind him. The second burst ripped through men standing shoulder to shoulder. The third burst sent others diving for the ground. The quiet farmyard exploded into screams, gunfire, and panic. Funk shouted at the American guards to grab weapons. They moved instantly. One rolled toward a fallen German and ripped a rifle from his hands. Another dove behind a low wall and snatched up an MP-40. The third pulled himself out of the open snow and fired at a German trying to aim at Funk. The fourth scrambled for cover and came up shooting. In less than 10 seconds, the Germans had lost control of the yard. They had numbers, they had weapons, they had the advantage, but they had been standing in the open, packed together, convinced one American was surrendering. Funk turned that belief against them. The Thompson fired .45 caliber rounds at close range. In a tight farmyard, it was devastating. Every short burst dropped another man or forced a cluster of soldiers to scatter. Germans tried to raise their weapons, but Funk did not stay still. He moved while firing. He shifted his angle. He used the sudden confusion like cover. His first magazine ran dry. The click could have killed him. But Funk was faster than panic. He dropped the empty magazine, pulled another from his pouch, slammed it into the Thompson, worked the bolt, and fired again. The reload took only seconds. By then, the guards were in the fight. German soldiers who had been laughing at captured Americans were now being shot by those same men with their own weapons. Some tried to run toward the farmhouse. Others tried to drop behind wagons, fences, or bodies. A few fired back blindly. Funk kept cutting through the center. He was not firing wildly. He fired in bursts. Move, aim, burst, shift, burst. The Germans outnumbered the Americans badly, but their formation was shattered. Their officer was dead. Their plan was dead with him. The rear attack on Company C was collapsing before it even began. A German soldier turned toward one of the kneeling guards who had just armed himself. Funk saw it and fired. The man dropped. Another German raised a rifle toward Funk from beside the farmhouse door. One of the American guards shot him first. The whole fight lasted less than a minute, 45 seconds. That was all it took. When the shooting stopped, the farmyard was covered with German dead and wounded. 21 Germans were down for good. Dozens more were hit. The rest threw their weapons into the snow and raised their hands again. The prisoners were prisoners once more. The guards were alive. Company C had not been attacked from behind. And Leonard Funk stood in the middle of the yard with an empty Thompson. The same Germans who had ordered him to surrender were now staring at him from the ground. The silence after the gunfire felt unreal. Smoke drifted from weapons. Wounded men groaned. Snow around the farmhouse was torn up by footprints, shell marks, and blood. The 4 American guards looked at Funk like they had just watched something impossible happen. 1 minute, they had been on their knees. The next, the man who walked into the trap had turned it inside out. Funk checked the yard. He made sure the guards had control. Then he ordered the Germans secured again. There was no speech. No celebration. No dramatic pose. There was still a war going on. Holzheim had only just been taken. German resistance still existed around the village. Company C was still exposed. Men were still fighting in the cold. Funk did what he always did after surviving the impossible. He went back to work. The battalion commander arrived later and walked through the farmyard. He saw the dead Germans. He saw the wounded. He listened to the guards describe how the prisoners had been freed, how Funk had walked in alone, how the officer had ordered him to surrender, and how the whole thing ended in less than a minute. The commander understood immediately. This was not luck alone. Luck had brought Funk around that corner. Training, nerve, and violence of action had saved everyone after that. A Medal of Honor recommendation began. But Leonard Funk's war did not end at Holzheim. The Battle of the Bulge still had to be finished. German forces were retreating, but retreating armies can still kill. The roads were mined, towns were defended, artillery kept falling, machine guns waited in upper windows, barns, tree lines, and crossroads. Every village cost something. Funk continued leading Company C through Belgium. He had been fighting for months. Normandy had taken a piece of every man who jumped there. Holland had taken more. The Ardennes winter had taken sleep, warmth, feeling from fingers, and sometimes the will to keep moving. But Funk did not break. He led from the front because that was the only way he knew. Men followed him because they had seen what happened when things went wrong. In Normandy, he brought scattered paratroopers home through enemy territory. In Holland, he attacked anti-aircraft guns with only 2 men. In Belgium, he turned clerks into assault troops, and then took back 80 prisoners with a Thompson. Company C knew that if Leonard Funk was moving forward, the job could be done. By February, the German offensive had failed. The huge bulge in the Allied lines was being pushed back. The road to Germany was opening again, but victory still demanded blood. The Americans crossed into Germany. Now the enemy was defending its own soil. The mood changed. Some German units surrendered quickly, exhausted and hopeless. Others fought with a desperation that made every town dangerous. Boys, old men, veterans, SS units, regular army soldiers, scattered groups with machine guns and panzerfausts. The war was dying, but it was not dead yet. Funk and the 82nd Airborne kept moving. Roads, villages, river crossings, woods, factories, prisoners by the hundreds, then thousands. The German army was collapsing under pressure from every direction. The Soviets were driving from the east. British, Canadian, and American forces were pushing from the west. The air was filled with Allied aircraft again. German cities burned. Supply lines broke. Commanders lost contact with units. Soldiers began surrendering in waves. But for the men at the front, the end of the war did not feel clean. A single sniper could still kill you. A single artillery shell could still erase a squad. A single mine in a road could still make a mother receive a telegram. Funk understood that better than anyone. He had survived too many moments to believe he was untouchable. He kept checking his men, kept pushing them to stay alert, kept reminding them that the last day of the war could kill a man as easily as the first. In March 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine River. It was one of the last great barriers into Germany. Once the Rhine was crossed, the road into the heart of the Reich opened wider with every mile. The 82nd Airborne advanced deeper into Germany. Funk saw a different kind of battlefield now, towns with white sheets hanging from windows, German soldiers walking out with hands raised, civilians staring from doorways, bridges blown, roads crowded with prisoners, smoke columns rising from places that had once seemed untouchable. The war that had swallowed Europe was finally turning into defeat for Germany. Still, Company C moved carefully. Funk had not made it through Normandy, Market Garden, and the Bulge by trusting quiet streets. He knew silence could be a weapon. By April, American forces reached the Elbe River. Across the water, Soviet troops were coming from the other side. Berlin lay beyond them, but orders had changed. The Americans would not take the city. The Soviets would. Funk and his men waited. For men who had fought so long, waiting almost felt harder. They could see the end, but could not step past it. Then, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Leonard Funk had survived. He had jumped into Normandy, fought in Holland, endured the Ardennes, captured villages in Belgium, crossed into Germany, and stood on the edge of a defeated empire. He had been wounded. He had been decorated. He had watched men die. And he had once laughed while a German officer ordered him to surrender. Now the paperwork from Holzheim caught up with him. The army reviewed the action, the witnesses, the numbers, the impossible odds, the fact that 4 American guards had been captured, the fact that 80 Germans had been freed and rearmed, the fact that a counterattack from the rear could have hit Company C while it was still vulnerable, and the fact that 1 U.S. sergeant ended it in 45 seconds. The Medal of Honor citation would use formal language, gallantry, intrepidity. disregard for personal safety, overwhelming enemy force, but no official sentence could fully capture the farmyard. It could not capture the German officer's gun pressed into Funk's stomach. It could not capture the laughter. It could not capture the slow movement of the Thompson coming off his shoulder. It could not capture the moment when the Germans believed they had won. Or the next moment, when they realized they had been wrong.